Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This case is called the People vs. Maya Hernandez. But we are here today because of two young boys, two babies. One lost his life and one lost his brother. We are here because of 1-year-old Emilio Gutierrez and 2-year-old Mateo Gutierrez. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because on June 29th, 2025, the defendant, the biological mother to Emilio and Mateo, the one person who is supposed to protect, supposed to put her two sons above everything else, chose herself. On that day, June 29th, 2025, the defendant chose vanity. She chose her appearance over her sons. And that choice cost Emilio his life. On June 29th, 2025, in the heart of Bakersfield summer, the defendant Maya Hernandez drove from Visalia to Bakersfield. She drove here with her two sons, Emilio and Mateo. She drove here to an elective cosmetic procedure, a procedure to enhance her looks. And ladies and gentlemen, when she drove here, she knew that she could bring the boys, Emilio and Mateo, into the appointment with her. She knew they were welcome. She knew they could wait inside the air conditioning. But she chose to leave them in the car. She chose a break. She chose time to herself. She chose time to socialize with other adults. And again, that choice cost Emilio his life. That choice cost Mateo his brother. From approximately 2:05 p.m. to 4:30 p.m., the defendant sat inside the building at 31 South Real Road. You will see this is a office building type situation. There's a lobby, and then there are rooms where the procedures occur. The defendant sat inside of the lobby in a chair, socializing, engaging in conversations, speaking to other patrons, helping another mother watch her child for over 2 hours while Emilio perished in the car. While Emilio burned from the inside out. She did not leave that building a single time between 2:05 p.m. and 4:30 to check on her sons. She chose to ignore all of her responsibilities. She ignored the fact that she had children that day. She ignored the fact that they were in the car. She spoke about her children, ladies and gentlemen. She told the other patrons in the spa that she had children. What she failed to acknowledge, what she failed to ever say, is that her children were in the car. She didn't tell anybody this information because she knew it was wrong. She knew her two babies should not be in the car without her in the heat. But she chose to leave them there anyway. When law enforcement and medical personnel ultimately arrived, Emilio and Mateo were both transported to the hospital. Emilio arrived at the hospital just after 5 p.m., little over 30 minutes after being found by the defendant, his mother. And at that time, ladies and gentlemen, his internal temperature was 107.2 degrees. Emergency room doctors and nurses spent over 40 minutes attempting to perform life-saving measures on Emilio. Those life-saving measures were ineffective. They failed. They failed because they were too late. They failed because he had already been left in excruciating temperatures up to 116 degrees for 2 hours. And on June 29th, 2025, Emilio was pronounced deceased at 5:48 p.m. at 1 year and 20 days old. He was pronounced deceased so that his mother, the defendant, Maya Hernandez, could obtain cosmetic procedures, so she could work on her appearance. That is why we are here today, ladies and gentlemen. That is why Emilio is not here. So she could work on her looks instead of working on being a parent. I want to take a few minutes and go through the actual evidence that I anticipate you will hear in this case, explain to you how it's going to play out. And I'm going to ask you to pay attention closely from the very beginning. Listen carefully. The evidence is probably going to come fairly quickly. I do not anticipate significant factual dispute as to what happened on that day. So please listen from witness number one. We are probably going to conclude evidence by next week. It is going to be quick. The information, the defendant has been charged with murder. But as we discussed in voir dire, ladies and gentlemen, it is important for you to recognize that she is charged with second-degree murder. We will talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Second-degree murder of Emilio Gutierrez, involuntary manslaughter of Emilio, child abuse with the enhancement of willful harm or injury resulting in death of Emilio. Count 4, child abuse for Mateo. Mateo survived. You will hear why Mateo survived and Emilio did not. We just talked about this briefly, but how did we get here? We got here based upon the defendant's choices, the defendant's actions, the defendant's intentional actions on June 29th, 2025, when she drove from Visalia to Bakersfield with her 1 and 2-year-old in the car. She drove for an elective cosmetic procedure. She waited inside of the building for 2.5 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be important because what you are also going to hear is that she did not have to be, not only did she not have to be in the building at all, her appointment lasted 15 to 20 minutes. The majority of the time the defendant was inside of that building while Emilio perished, she was sitting in the lobby waiting, playing on her Apple Watch, talking to other patrons. Her procedure lasted 15 to 20 minutes. She was seen going into the med spa at approximately 2:04 p.m. She left at approximately 4:33 p.m. You are going to hear this morning from the officers that were initially called out to the scene, the responding officers, and that's going to be Officers Velez Aguilar and Officers Fahel. They were the first law enforcement officers that arrived. When they arrived, Hall ambulance personnel were already attempting life-saving measures on Emilio. You will hear this morning that when officers arrived, Emilio was unconscious. He was lifeless. His lips and limbs were blue. He was limp, and he was not breathing. That was his condition at the med spa before going to the hospital. Emilio was ultimately transported to the hospital, at which point officers came into contact with Mateo. Mateo was not in nearly the same condition as Emilio, but he was lethargic, he was red, and he was drenched in sweat when he was ultimately located. And it's important to recognize and remember, ladies and gentlemen, that not only were these two babies trapped in the car, they were trapped and strapped inside of their car seats. They could not leave even if they were able to. At Adventist Health Hospital, Emilio, as we discussed earlier, started receiving treatment from doctors and nurses. This is when it was determined that his temperature was 107.2 degrees. You will hear from the treating nurse, Gabrielle Long, tomorrow. She will talk to you about how Emilio presented when he arrived at the hospital. She will tell you about the temperature and how she obtained that temperature. You will hear about the significance of that temperature. You will hear from Dr. Thomas Riley, the attending physician. You will hear the length of time the length of efforts doctors and nurses spent attempting to revive Emilio. And you will hear that he was ultimately pronounced deceased at 5:48 p.m. on June 29, 2025. You will hear from Nurse Elizabeth Bond. She is the nurse that provided treatment to Mateo. You will hear from her that Mateo, while lethargic and sweaty, he was okay when he arrived. His temperature was 99 degrees. You will hear from her and from the coroner, in this case, Dr. Glinecki, that there is an explanation as to why Emilio and Mateo's conditions were significantly different. And that explanation, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be because of their ages, essentially. Babies around 1 year old do not have the ability to regulate their temperatures. They don't have the sweat glands that develop as we get older. Emilio could not release the heat from his body. He could not regulate his own temperatures while he was strapped into that car seat. You will hear from witnesses. This morning, you'll hear from Shelby Murch, Ian Blue. Tomorrow, you'll hear from the nurse that provided the treatment to the defendant. You'll hear from her assistant. And what you will hear is much of what you will also see in the video surveillance, that the defendant sat inside the lobby for about 2 hours, that she socialized, she conversed. You will hear from Shelby and Ian that she mentioned having 2 babies, never mentioned them being with her. You will hear from Ian that at one point he went out to his car to give his dog a walk at about 3 p.m. He walked by the defendant's vehicle, and he will tell you that there were no signs that the vehicle was running, that any activity was happening within the vehicle, or that anybody was inside. You will also hear from Ian that it was so hot outside, he actually chose to skip the walk, pick his dog up, and take his dog back inside for water. Ian wouldn't keep his dogs in the same temperature that the defendant left her babies. You will hear that the procedure only lasted about 15 to 20 minutes. And ladies and gentlemen, you will also hear that not only did the defendant not go out to check on her children during the 2 hours she was inside, when she went outside at 4:30, it still was not to check on her children. When she left that business at about 4:33 p.m., she was going to her car to get her phone to pay for her procedure. It was by happenstance at that time that she saw Emilio and Mateo and the conditions they were in. At that time, she brought Emilio into the business, flagged down Isabel Carrion, who you will hear from tomorrow. Isabel brought Mateo into the business. And you're going to hear from Shelby and Ian that they were shocked to learn that she had children with her based upon her behaviors inside of the spa. You will also see the text messages that the defendant exchanged with the injector, with the registered nurse that provided the treatment. Text messages where she says, "Can I bring my kids inside?" Or "Can I bring my kids in by chance?" "Sure, if you don't mind them waiting in the waiting area, hun." That message, ladies and gentlemen, came before the defendant ever left Visalia for Bakersfield. To kind of piggyback off this information, you're also going to hear that the defendant did have an option for a babysitter that day. She knew she could have asked her sister, and her sister probably would have said yes, but she chose not to. You will also hear that on July 2nd, 2025, detectives with the Bakersfield Police Department performed a recreation of events. What does this mean? It means they took conditions almost identical to the time and date of June 29th, 2025. They selected a date with almost identical temperatures outside. They drove the vehicle the same exact amount of time it would have taken the defendant to drive from Visalia to Bakersfield. They parked the vehicle in the same spot at 31 South Real Road. They parked it at the same exact time the defendant is seen by video surveillance arriving. They shut it off at the exact time the defendant is seen getting out of her car. They left it in the exact condition the defendant stated it had been left in. They left it there for the exact same time until the defendant came out of the business at 4:33. While this recreation was taking place, they placed calibrated thermometers inside the vehicle. Inside the vehicle and inside Emilio's car seat to see how hot did this seat get. How hot was this car while Emilio was strapped into this car seat? They recorded the temperatures with body-worn camera footage. You, ladies and gentlemen, will get to watch the temperatures rise and rise and rise. You will see from between 2:15 and 4:33, the temperatures rose from 81.8 degrees to 116 degrees. At 4:33 p.m., the temperature in that car was 116 degrees. You will see video, you will see photographs of the thermometer. You will see an increase in over 34 degrees while Emilio was strapped in his car seat and the defendant was sitting inside of the air-conditioned medical spa. You will see video surveillance. And I included this photograph up here, ladies and gentlemen, because this photograph to the far left, if you're looking at it, that is the seat the defendant sat in. May seem insignificant where she sat until you hear, ladies and gentlemen, that she chose a seat facing away from the window. She chose a seat in the part of the med spa where her vehicle could not be seen. And never once did she get up to look out the window. Never once did she exit that med spa to check on her children. Never once did she check the well-being of her children in 2.5 hours. You'll hear from the defendant that she intentionally left them in the car. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. She did not forget them. She knew they were there. She left them in the car. You will hear that she knew the dangers of doing so. She knew before she got out of her car that if she left them in the car, Emilio and Mateo could be injured, that they could die. She knew that. You will hear that with that knowledge, with that information, she did it anyway. She knew she could cause the death to the children, and she left them there anyway. You will hear about the autopsy. This will come probably on Wednesday of this week. Dr. Glenicki performed the autopsy. Emilio died of hyperthermia, which is commonly referred to as heat stroke, due to being left in the vehicle. Now, second-degree murder. This is where you're going to take all of the facts that you hear and you're going to put it with the law. And as we discussed in voir dire, second-degree murder can be arrived at 2 different ways. First way, implied malice, commission of an act.
Your Honor, I'm going to object argument.
And that is the defendant committed an act that caused the death of Emilio. When the defendant acted, she had the state of mind called malice aforethought. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to focus in this case. You are going to be working with an implied malice. That is second-degree murder. What implied malice means is that she intentionally committed the act.
Objection, argument.
You can continue to describe what implied malice is.
Thank you. The natural and probable consequences of the act were dangerous to human life in that the act involved a high degree of probability that it would result in death. At the time she acted, she knew the act was dangerous to human life. She deliberately acted with conscious disregard for human life. Keep these things in mind throughout the evidence. It will make the evidence more clear. It will make your job easier at the end. The second way, failure to protect as a mother. The defendant had a legal duty to protect Emilio, and the defendant failed to perform that duty, and that duty caused the death of Emilio. When the defendant failed to act, she had a state of mind called malice aforethought. That is the same state of mind that we just discussed, ladies and gentlemen. The same 4 requirements. Keep these in mind with you as you work through the evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you, as you listen to the evidence over the next couple of days, keep some things in mind. 1, there are no accidents here. There are no accidents in this case. This isn't a case of a forgotten child whose mom was in a hurry. These were intentional actions done willfully by the defendant. Keep in mind also that we are here because of choices. Choices made by the defendant. Choices made to leave her children in the car. Choices made to put her appearance before her children. And ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this case, after you have heard all of the evidence, I will have another opportunity to come up here and speak with you. And at that time, I'm going to ask you to consider the defendant's actions, the defendant's choices. And I'm going to ask you to come into this courtroom and tell her that there are consequences to her choices. And you are going to do that by choosing to find her guilty of second-degree murder of Emilio and child endangerment of Mateo. I'm confident that that is the choice you will make after you hear the evidence in this case. That is the choice that will be best supported by the facts, by the evidence, and by the law. I will be asking at the end of this case for a guilty verdict to all charges and enhancements. Thank you for your time.